you all so much for coming. My name is Lauren Singer, and I'm in the home stretch here at NYU. And as a senior with only a few weeks left in the year, this is going to be the last event that I'm hosting as not only an undergraduate student, but a member of Oxfam America at NYU. When I was an impressionable young sophomore pursuing environmental studies and politics, I was introduced to the extremely complex issue of hydraulic fracturing through Josh Fox's Gasland, which is a story that I'm sure many of you can relate to. I would scour the internet for news stories, befriend activists for support, question my friends whose families are in gas. I even got jobs at the DEP and the mayor's office to try to figure out what fracking was, why it was happening, and to gauge whether it was friend or foe. As someone that doesn't like to immediately believe what people tell me and does like to form my own opinions, I felt angry, I was passionate, and I was very confused. On the one hand, I was being told that fracking was totally safe. It created jobs, stimulated our economy, would end our dependence on foreign oil, helped communities, and helped America. But on the other hand, I was told that fracking tainted water, corrupted aquifers, harmed our economy, killed jobs in the renewable sector, hindered progress, hurt communities, and would destroy America. Frankly, it's very hard to know who and what to believe when it comes to fracking. And for any of you who know me even a little bit, you know where I stand on fracking. But that confidence did not come easily. And even in the beginning, when I was planning rallies in Washington Square Park, or fervently blogging, or getting on buses to Albany or Pennsylvania or DC to rally and lobby, or skipping class to shout at buildings where CEO worked, or any of that, I was bouncing beliefs and things people told me, things my friends and people that I'd come to love and trust told me around my head. And I just wanted the truth. Then I read the first article in Ian Urbina's Drilling Down series. And it really was the first neutral and clarifying voice on fracking that I had heard in this world of extremely loud noise. I've been wanting Ian Urbina to come to NYU for years. Not because he's from the New York Times, not because he's highly acclaimed, but because for the first time, someone was not telling me what to think or how to feel, just providing me with the best possible tools from which I could make my own decisions, the facts. Tonight is made possible because of an introduction I got to Elizabeth Riedel through a friend of mine, Tim Woodcock. Elizabeth and Ian Urbina met through her own work on the topic of hydraulic fracturing. In addition to her law practice, which involves commercial real estate, construction, finance, and risk management, Elizabeth also focuses on energy and environmental conservation issues at the state and local levels. She's the president of the Larchmont-Mamaroneck chapter of the League of Women Voters and chairs the Committee on Energy, Agriculture, and the Environment of the New York State League of Women's Voters. Elizabeth's research on the impacts of shale gas drilling on property ownership, the allocations of rights, risks, and liability, and the further impacts on homeowner mortgages and the secondary mortgage market has appeared in numerous publications. Her letter to the Federal Housing Finance Agency in 2011, alerting the agency to her research findings, and her cover story for the New York State Bar Association Journal magazine titled Homeowners and Gas Drilling Leases, Boon or Bust, were sourced and cited by Ian Urbina in his Drilling Down series. Elizabeth has also testified at DEC and New York State Senate hearings regarding the management of risks associated with hydraulic fracturing on residential property and the potential ripple effects to New York homeowners and state taxpayers. Please, everyone, welcome Elizabeth Riedel.
Thank you, Lauren. It's great to be here and see so many familiar faces. Are you all as excited about being here tonight as I am? Yeah. When I was growing up, I used to think about what it would be like to be in a show with my singer idols like Aretha Franklin or Bonnie Raitt. And standing up here tonight as the warm-up act for Ian Urbina, I can tell you this feels really cool. New York is the nerve center on the topic of hydraulic fracturing. We are committed to go the distance to get the facts. For this reason, New York is setting the standard for the rest of America when it comes to our due diligence. People are here tonight because you appreciate the gold standard in journalistic reporting. Before Ian Urbina joins us, I want to talk about you, about all of us. The journalistic reach in Ian's New York Times reporting on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the Drilling Down series examined topics that touch each of us, either directly or indirectly. In his Drilling Down series, topics ran the gamut from the risks associated with high-volume drilling to EPA's regulation of the oil and gas industry, the shale gas investment, the relationship between gas leases and mortgages, and road dangers to truckers in the oil industry, among others. The more we read of Ian's work, the more we wanted to read. The reason? We traveled with Ian down deep beyond the surface, beyond the facade. The detailed reporting transcended business as usual. Ian brought us in to participate in the experience. On topics such as high-volume hydraulic fracturing, details can make all the difference. For example, the reported estimates of recoverable shale gas and the reported frequency of well cement and well casing failures can combine to influence how national energy policy is shaped and which energy choices we make. Life in this arena is truly in the details. And here's where you come in. We each have the opportunity to identify and speak or write about the details that contribute to the energy news. And I would submit we each should shoulder the responsibility to speak up when we identify in the media details which mischaracterize the facts, or we discover facts in our backyard, or generally which deserve disclosure. The term cumulative impacts applies here as much to our individual vigilance and input as it does to monitoring the long-term effects of shale gas drilling life cycle. To those here who rely on blogs, websites, and even the conventional press for news, please question the details, question the sources. What made the Drilling Down series so compelling, aside from Ian's accessible writing style, is the thousands of pages of reference material he archived online to back up his reporting. Anyone with a computer and a free weekend can access this wealth of information to fact check. Of those thousands of pages, despite many requests from the oil and gas industry, the New York Times editors reviewed the series and not a single item had to be corrected. In a world where actual merges with virtual and public relations can influence our perception of reality, checking the facts and connecting the details to educate ourselves, those who govern us, and those who market what we consume, trains the monologue into a potentially game-changing dialogue. Tonight was made possible to discuss process as well as substance, to bring to your worldview an understanding of the elements of excellence in journalism, to understand what makes enduring investigative reporting different from the status quo. Tonight is your night to ask questions of Ian which have been on your mind. And when you go home from here, I hope you will leave transformed and fortified to actively demand and keep the news factual down to the very last detail. If we each participate in the news-making process in this way, we can have a say in what the cumulative impacts will be. Thank you for being here, and enjoy.
Me for 1 second. I just want to tell you quickly about tonight's format so you all know what to expect. Ian Urbina will speak and then he'll take questions from the audience. Please limit your questions to one per person, about 1 or 2 sentences, nothing too lengthy, so we can get in as many questions as possible. Professor Colin Jerelmack, who I will introduce in a moment, will moderate the question and answer and invite you to stay afterwards for refreshments. Colin Jerelmack is easily, one of the best professors that I've had at NYU. He's intelligent, eloquent, and extremely sharp. He's an assistant professor of environmental studies and sociology at NYU, where he also teaches in the animal studies minor. He received his PhD in sociology from the City University of New York, and is the author of The Global Pigeon, a book about how human-animal relations shape city life. It can also be found in last week's New York Times. Please welcome Colin Jeromack.
So you know you're important when you get 2 introductions. I'm just here to give some of the more boring biographical information, but to make sure that it's all entered in the official record about Ian. He was born in Washington, D.C. He has degrees in history from Georgetown University as well as the University of Chicago. He was also a Fulbright Scholar and did research in Havana, Cuba. Before joining the Times, his writings would span domestic and foreign policy, appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, and elsewhere. Before he became an investigative correspondent for the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, Mr. Urbina had been a national correspondent covering the Mid-Atlantic states since 2005. In that role, he was instrumental in keeping the Times abreast of West Virginia coal mining disaster, as well as, of course, the BP oil spill, breaking many of the stories about companies cutting corners, lax oversight by federal officials, themes that would come up again in his research on hydraulic fracturing. He was also, importantly, a member of the team of reporters that broke the story about then-Governor Eliot Spitzer and his misdeeds, which earned him part of the Pulitzer Prize in 2009. In 2012, he received the Society of Business Editors and Writers Best in Business Award for his investigative series, Drilling Down, which is what has brought him here to NYU for Earth Week today. It was already mentioned what some of these articles were about. I've just mentioned in passing that perhaps the most significant was the first one that he wrote, which is about the effect of, or what happened to the produced water or the flowback that comes back out of wells once they've been fracked. And he showed how half of it at the time in Pennsylvania was being trucked to public sewage, which wasn't equipped to treat it and which wasn't monitoring for radiation, this led to all, this was a major story. It's hard to overestimate the impact that this had. Former DEP Secretary John Hanger complained openly about some of the results. As he said, it triggered a massive testing of Pennsylvania waters for radiation. It forced EPA to police Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection more than they had been. And then there's other stories that caused the Energy Information Administration to explain itself to members of the U.S. House of Representatives and so on. This is some of what John Hanger wrote about in his blog. The significance of his research has also been very apparent to other people with more environmental concerns. A lot of you are probably familiar with Bill McKibben's New York Review of Books, alleged review of 2 books about hydraulic fracturing, but which he spent a large amount of time talking about Ian's work and saying that it was some of the most important work being done on the issue and ought to earn him a Pulitzer when he was supposed to be reviewing 2 other books that had been written. Now, as for me, I think that what I find so valuable for him is really I try to look at it through the perspective of the students that I teach and that other people teach in environmental studies. We have 2 tracks in environmental studies: a sort of social science philosophy track that we call Values in Society, and then the natural science track. And on the natural science side of it, I think what Ian has to teach them is about making very complex issues legible and intelligible to a wide mass of people. And but on the other side, perhaps even more significant or more of a feat, is to be a citizen scientist without having a specialized background or a higher degree in natural science issues, but to feel comfortable enough and confident enough and learn enough to be able to wade into really complex issues. And you have to be able to discern issues that you got your hands on through right-to-know requests and all that. And I think that it's this kind of blending of the social, political, and economic with the natural science to try to understand the complex environmental problems that we have is one of the things that we're trying to impart on our students in environmental studies. And I can say as well that some of what he's done has partly been an inspiration for my own work, in that I am actually on sabbatical right now and living in central Pennsylvania doing an ethnographic study on how natural gas drilling is shaping community life. And I'm trying to dig in one particular place many of the controversies that have erupted as a response to Ian's writings. Issues about leasing, the counterclaims made by the industry, the economic impact, and so on. And I'll just say, the last thing I'll say is, even though often an investigative reporter moves on to a new story, a new line of questioning, that we can see the way they're connected, or at least I did when I saw his recent article about how many household chemicals are not tested. One of the things that many of you may know is that often what the natural gas industry says is that the chemicals that we're putting under the ground are no different than the chemicals that you have under your sink. The implication being that we know what's in those chemicals and the impact they have. And so the investigation continues.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Beth, Lauren, Colin, this will be a lesson to me to never allow 2 introductions because it gets so over the top and superlative. I can't live up to that. So my plan was simple, to talk about essentially what were the goals of the series, what impetus we had in starting to investigate the topic, and then a little bit about sort of the challenges we ran into along the way, and interestingly how those challenges ended up guiding the subsequent stories, and sort of determining for us what the next story would be based on what the last obstacle was. And then lastly, to run through some territory that Beth and Colin touched on, which is just sort of a rundown for those here who perhaps haven't read the series, just want a couple of the findings, and then open up to Q&A. So I'm going to try to move quickly because I think the Q&A session is the most interesting. As was stated originally, I was given the investigative beat about 3 weeks before the BP spill. And I had been a national geographic reporter, covered the 8 states at the time was called the Atlantic region that run from Kentucky to Ohio. And I switched beats and became investigative, and then the spill occurred, and it was the sort of first big investigation that was tossed my way. Everyone knows that story well. And so as we came out of it several months later, there was a meeting that, sit down with my editor, and we were batting around ideas of what to do next. And my hope had always been to be logged sort of one topic and to be allowed the luxury of pursuing it for a year. That's, I think, many reporters' dream, and in many ways I have that dream job for reporters. And so the question came up, which was, well, in the BP spill we learned a lot about what works and, more to the point, what doesn't work in terms of offshore drilling, and how federal oversight of that is flawed, ways that it should be improved. What do we know about onshore drilling? And that question sort of sounded bells in my head because as a Mid-Atlantic reporter, I had put myself on a diet of once a month submitting open records requests to federal and state offices just to keep them flowing. And documents were coming in, but I never had the time to go through them. And so in my office, I had this stack of documents that were just sort of calling out for review. And a lot of them were from Pennsylvania. A lot of them were from the major story unfolding in Pennsylvania, namely drilling. And so all of a sudden I saw the stack, in my head, and this question from my editors, and the ability to connect the two. So I left. Thus began, a very intense and at times rocky, but thoroughly fulfilling project. And it was a project that, before we started, and so, to answer the question, well, my editor said, what do we know about onshore drilling? And I came back 2 weeks later and said, look, if we're going to do onshore drilling, there is a boom unfolding in this country. It's being driven by this sort of innovation of technologies, and Pennsylvania's ground zero, at least on the East Coast, and that's what we should do. We should look at, kind of what this boom means. So then the next question was, well, there are reporters out there who've done amazing work, Abraham Luskarn and in Pennsylvania, some reporters, AP, and some smaller reporters out west, at small venues who've been doing really good reporting on this. So what is it new that we can do? So 2 weeks later we came back, and the answer that we came up with was essentially twofold. One was, and this was my impression, and I think some might disagree, but my impression was at that moment, the majority of the coverage of this topic, drilling, was binary in that it pivoted on a dichotomy between jobs and the environment. I thought that one service the Times could provide was to get away from that binary seesaw and approach this topic of drilling from more angles. And I'll explain what I meant by that. I fear that most people in this audience sort of know every sentence I'm going to say before I say it. The peril of taking on speaking engagement with folks who know your own series better than you. But so one thought was, let's try to do a series that doesn't pivot on the environmental story alone. Let's look at it from other new angles. The other thought was, let's see if we can sort of attempt to do a little bit of a different sort of journalism. And the sort of buzz expression that my editor and I sort of put on it was, let's not produce two-dimensional stories, let's try to produce three-dimensional platforms. What that simply meant was documents. So rather than writing a story that is well reported and sound, but it, at root has a lot of according to official X or said Mr. Y, or rather than that, let's attempt to write stories that hold the reader, any significant claim we make, let's hold the story until we can get documents if they're achievable, and let's put the documents up on the website, and let's have a sort of another dimension behind the two-dimensional story. So that for the truly interested, many of them probably sitting in this room, you could click on it and it would pull you into almost a portal to another realm of documents. And that was a risky call, and one that I really am, again, lucky to have had an editor and an editor above him and a newspaper above them that were willing to put that level of resources into it. So what that in practice meant was, with the first story, it took about 6 months to report, and then we held it for about almost 2 more months. Because we could have put it in the paper in a sort of two-dimensional fashion, but we really wanted to land a lot of key documents we knew to exist. And the debate was, if you have 100 readers, how many of those readers really are going to go through those documents? It's a small percentage. I know, unfortunately, because of the internet and the techies at the time could tell me, as much as I told them not to tell me, how few people were actually going into the document reader. And so initially, that experiment was fraught, and it didn't seem to have returns. But with time, the three-dimensional nature of the series paid off. And here's how. So with each story, we put up a document reader. And again, I imagine many of you have looked at these, but they're sort of discreetly tucked into the left-hand side of the stories. And you click on a little link like that, and it takes you into another realm. And this document reader was over 1,000 pages long, I think, and it's chock full of emails and unreleased reports and public documents, but ones that are in Greek, essentially, to the average person, myself originally among those. But they tie to the story itself. And what was interesting about these document readers, and with each story we had one like this, was that the techies originally were hitting me over the head with how few people and how short the period was that people were going into the document reader. But then within weeks, especially after this story, but also a story about leases, and there was a steady uptick, not just in the number of people going into the document reader, but how long they were sitting on them. And well, you can see who they are because they're IP addresses, and a lot of them are federal and state regulators. And so all of a sudden, sort of, I was no longer sheepishly, looking to the ground in these discussions about what to do next. I was sort of proudly saying, look, people that can make a difference are actually studying these documents. And so this is a long-winded way of saying, I do think that the thing that I am most proud of the Times for in this series is the document component to these stories, as Beth pointed out. But anyway, so the two goals were three-dimensional platforms, really document-rich, and attempt to come at these stories from different angles. So what about those angles? The notion was, rather than, very early on, it seemed apparent to me that there were a couple of curiosities about this topic. Remember, we're in a very different moment now than we were circa, mid-2010, late 2010, in terms of the discussion on fracking. Back then, there was a strange unanimity, relatively speaking, around the issue of fracking. So you had excitement from Wall Street, excitement from Washington, excitement from large environmental organizations, excitement from state regulators, even, very public. And that sort of general consensus, obviously there were voices in the wilderness that were asking good questions and raising skepticism, but in general, that consensus was something that really attracted the Times, because when you have that sort of consensus on a topic, especially something like energy, where there's a lot at stake, a lot of money, a lot of land, it usually squelches rigorous, thorough thinking. And so the editor's thought was, let's get in there and let's ask questions about that consensus and the assumptions upon which it's based, and try to force a broader discussion on the topic. So to do that was to attempt to come at this from different angles. So rather than just an environmental story, we wanted to approach it as a geopolitical story. This new technology was being quietly but aggressively promoted by a division within the State Department. Why? Why should the U.S. government be pushing for a specific type of drilling? And again, many of you, I think, know the answer to that. But there was an important geopolitical story to be told. There was a legal story, and Beth Rideout is perhaps one of the most knowledgeable people on this topic. But a curious question emerged, which was, there are millions of people, millions of average Americans out there who are signing this document, this contract, with large companies typically. And we would like to just take a look at these documents, these contracts. So where's the repository that we, an average citizen, a lawyer, a professor, or a reporter, can go and see what a contract, a lease, looks like from Texas, circa 2008, and compare it to a lease from North Dakota, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, New York. Let's look at these. Amazingly enough, we couldn't find a repository. In fact, what we found were obstacles when we went state by state and said, could we look at your leases? They are public documents. We hit obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And when we talked even to lawyers, they would say, well, I can't really share with you the ones I have about 7. It was a paltry sum compared to the number of ones in existence. So that immediately got our attention. A simple question that seemed to run into barriers. So there's a legal story, and that was one of them. There was a worker safety story. this is a dangerous line of work. But what are the dangers? And to what degree are federal or state officials policing those dangers? Again, simple question, surprising initial answers. You'd think that the deaths that come in this industry would be from guys, because it's mostly guys falling off rigs. And actually, that's not the case. Most of the deaths are from people falling asleep at the wheel. And that, again, a curiosity that emerged, and we thought, well, let's look into that further. Well, it turns out that, this industry is famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for the exemptions it has won for itself. Exemptions to many federal laws. There was yet another exemption to the rules that apply to how long people can drive trucks, that allowed these workers to work obscenely long shifts. And that was a contributing factor to the strangely high rate of people dying from falling asleep at the wheel. With every one of these angles, there's a financial story, again, that got really strong pushback for, I think, obvious reasons, which, again, having nothing to do with the environment per se, but all roads ultimately lead to the environment to some degree on this topic. But this was a story, again, most are probably familiar with it, that emerged from whispers, going to conferences with drillers and hearing the excited rhetoric on one hand from the mic, but then the sort of at the coffee pot whispers on the other hand that said, yeah, for all the excitement about how easy this drilling is and is going to be, and how well these gas wells perform, and how long they last, it's far more complicated. Well, no one was saying this out loud to investors, to the public, to federal lawmakers. It was just pure excitement. So the thought in this story was, if we as a country are going to embrace this new source of energy, and yet folks inside the industry are themselves fairly skeptical about the hype surrounding how these wells perform, then shouldn't we at the Times try to put that out there and force a discussion, make the whispers public? So indeed, that was the financial story. We sat on it for a month while we gathered leaked emails with industry regulators, federal officials, chattering about their actual impression of how variable and difficult this drilling boom was going to be from a financial perspective. So anyway, I'll just say that, as many of you know, the story attempted to come at this topic from a range of different angles, ultimately with the simple hope that the discussion that was occurring on the op-ed pages in Congress, on the state level, at the water cooler, would no longer be a I'm for jobs, I'm for the environment type discussion, but it would be one that was more in the weeds, that at least asked better questions. I think we played a small part in doing that, because you look at the level of discussion that's occurring now, and it is far more sophisticated than it was in 2010. I'll stop there because I think the audience probably has very specific questions, and I'd love to hear those. I hope.
Is there any story that either came to light after you or during the series, or kind of got left out, but which has maybe grown in interest to you today, that if you were continuing the series you would like to do?
Yes, is the simple answer. Multiple. The radon story is a good story. I think a lot of people know about it. I don't know what I think about it. I looked pretty closely at it and opted not to write about it because personally, the documents I saw and the discussion I was seeing didn't convince me that the analysis that I was reading was firm enough to want to put it in the paper. But the questions about what happens, and again, it's hard to figure out the altitude of discussion, but on the simple level, the radon story is the story that, when this gas comes out of the ground, among the things that are part of the gas is radon. And what happens to that radon? Does it dissipate between wellhead and stove? Sort of what tracking is being done of the levels? So I think that's one story. The financial ties between big environmental groups and the oil and gas industry. I mean, I kick myself, we had that on the project memo, and we ran out of time to do it. And I can't remember who did it, but they did a really good job, and I give them kudos. And then the reporting that Reuters has been doing is amazing on Chesapeake and the financial irregularities of how that company, and to some degree as a poster child of many companies, those are the three stories that I have read that I envy. You want me to call you, Paul?
It's up to you. Maybe you can see better because I'm white.
Okay, I'll call. Go ahead.
You're obviously the brain trust on fracking for the Times. So how is it the Times can give us this gift in you, but on the other hand, publish such rubbish on people like Eduardo Porter and this op-ed on China Must Develop and the public advocate dithering, et cetera, et cetera. You can't have it both ways.
I'll be out of a job if I answer that question. First of all, I don't think I'm the brain trust. Here's what I can say on that. It may not be an answer you like. When we set out, this goes back to the consensus point I made at the beginning. When my editor and I set out to do the series, we intentionally set out to ask tough, critical questions. And our impression at that point was that's a legitimate decision because our view, and again, others, including reporters and some in the oil and gas industry, but not just the oil and gas industry, that disagreed with this call. But our view was that there was already substantial coverage of the benefits of the drilling boom, and there, at that point, was not sufficient coverage, in our view, of these tougher questions. So the series set out to be critical. Now, some have faulted it for that reason as unbalanced, and that's a larger journalistic debate. Everything is about context. In the context of itself, it is a series that is coming really from one angle, in the sense that it's asking very tough questions. And it's not spending a whole lot of time, though it did spend some in each article talking about the benefits, but it moves quickly through those to get to the tougher questions. So in and of itself, it is unbalanced. But in the context of the paper and the larger media at the time, our view was that it was actually balanced. So to answer your question, I personally think that when you look at the paper writ large, the sum total is still a fairly balanced compilation, because you have the combination of those, and there's a church-state divide, and you know this, so the news side folks shouldn't be judged by the editorials and vice versa. We're totally separate entities. What they do on the church side is belief, it's opinion, that's what it's supposed to be. What we do on the news side. So I'm just speaking of the news side. But on the news side, there are reporters that have differing questions that more interest them. And I do believe that the sum total of all those reporters balances out to a fuller picture of drilling. But there are many readers that don't read. So it's my attempted diplomatic answer. Amy in the black shirt in the front row.
Ian Craig Stevens, Northeastern Pennsylvania. We've been living with all the problems there, of course. We're right in the middle of the ground zero Marcellus Shale, but I'm finding it interesting. There's an absolute news blackout. Nobody will cover anything. We've been calling for weeks and weeks with new problems. No station will show up. But we had the creeks turn green last week, and We didn't know what it was, so we called and they brought everybody in, DEP. They tested the water supposedly, which they didn't. They didn't test until Friday with the rain. But we got 5 news agencies to show up because it was trout season starting on Saturday and this discoloration was a few days before. And that was a big story. But brand new contamination, endemic or other areas, was 0. When we called and asked them, they said ask their managers. Our concern, and maybe you can, in your research, find this, the money for the advertising is very big in the newspaper, the television and radio. There are ads on all the time. Our concern is that that could be influencing the ability to get people to show up because it's a non-issue story, even with brand new things. I know that it has to be new for them to show up, but what did you find anything in your research that showed maybe some bias on the news side?
So maybe I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I think before I joined the Times, I had read my share of Noam Chomsky and Manufactured Consent and sort of was steeped in that critique of the Times and other smaller papers. And having been at the Times for a decade now, I'm much less convinced by it, especially the Times. Because there's not just a church-state divide, but there's also a business news side. I've never even gotten a whiff of. The role of deep-pocketed advertisers on the news coverage, I've not seen it, and I always watch it. I'd love to see it. It'd be interesting to some degree, but I haven't ever seen it. I haven't heard it from other reporters. That said, I have talked with reporters at smaller papers who recount to me the pressures that they're under, and those are much less insulated institutions, obviously. And I've never heard a textbook anecdote, but I have heard a sort of diffuse culture of reluctance or heightened carefulness on some topics because of potential blowback. Blowback not just from advertisers withdrawing their ad perspective, but more just if you're the only venue in a small paper in a small market that comes out, it can become an embarrassment, and then the editors and publishers have to start answering whether that venue is skewed. And that's taxing, especially at a small institution where there are half the number of editors at the Times, and they have just as many hours in the day or just as few hours in the day to put out the paper and deal with these complaints. So anyway, it's not a concrete answer. I didn't see it. There was strong pushback to the series, and I have to say there's always disagreement inside. These are institutions populated by people with opinions about news and values, and so there were lots of disagreements. But on the journalism, the Times through and through was really strong and didn't flinch.
So given these two questions and your answers, and knowing that the Times has dissolved the environmental desk, what effect will that have on the reporting, and what are the chances of series like this being produced in the future? How detailed would they be?
So I'll restate the question just so that so the question is, well, there are a couple of comments. One is the dissolving of the environmental desk, and given the ending of the series, and what prospects are there for more of this type of journalism. So the environmental desk, the environmental cluster, was dissolved in one sense only, and that is that people were moved from a collection and instead put in desks. And my impression of that is there was a editorial decision about producing better environmental coverage that is more coherently tied to that desk. And not so much I think it has taken on this view in the public as they've pulled back on their environmental cluster and on their environmental coverage, and the net coverage has actually not gone down. Raw stories and number of reporters and number of editors, none of that has changed. It's just where they sit differs, and sort of how they're going to try to integrate their coverage into the respective desk where they reside differs. Science desk, business desk, metro, national, DC. So that's point one. Point two, the Times is doing a lot of investigative reporting on a range of topics. In my case, and I think most investigative reporters' case at the Times, usually a series usually lasts a year, maybe a little longer, and then the paper usually moves the reporter, encourages the reporter and the editor to move on to a new series, or else it starts becoming a beat, and that's something different than a series. So that was the case here. This actually was the Drilling Down series was an unusually long series because it had a lot of momentum to it, but I've switched to a new topic, and so to answer your question, I guess at the Times I can say nothing has changed fundamentally about their environmental coverage or about their will to do long format investigative reporting.
So I have a question that maybe you have answered already, but considering that you went through reports in Pennsylvania, I have a curiosity to know if you found any relationship between contamination produced by fracking and tainted organic produce, like Lancaster County and the Amish. Because many people here goes to Whole Foods or any place to find greens that are free of pesticides and all that. And I always wonder when I find things from Pennsylvania, how is it related to the water contamination that they dump at some point, or they continue dumping?
Okay, so just to restate the question, in our reporting, did we find a tie between between contamination on one end and organic produce on the other? The simple answer is no. We didn't connect the dots all the way there. What I can say though is how far we did connect dots, which is short of that, and we weren't aspiring to reach there. In the first story, the environmental story, as has been said, the focus was a simple question that, again, the series was driven by simple questions that were strangely difficult to answer. And so in this case, we know this drilling produces a lot of waste. We know that the waste has all sorts of different toxins in it. So where is it all going? And soon a question emerged, which was, we also know, because everyone says it, that including great reporters of ROM and others had said before, that there's radioactivity among the toxins in the waste. So how much? What type? And how's it being tracked? And oddly, we couldn't get an answer to that. And I'll sort of go long-winded for a second to tell an anecdote, because I think it's illustrative of the challenges of the larger series. So, question, was, all right, everyone knows there's radioactivity in the waste. How much, what levels, what sort of oversight? We, meaning my editor and I spent 2 weeks straight calling everyone I could find who knew anything about radioactivity and drilling. From US Geological Survey to professors in Colorado, everyone. And just asked the question, so there's radioactivity in the waste, sometimes some wells. Do you have data? How much? How many wells? And everyone kept giving me the same data set. It was 13, 21, some tiny little data set from New York, done 8, 9, 10 years ago. And I thought, well, this is really strange. There's this broad assumption about something pretty consequential based on a tiny and old data set. And there's this huge drilling boom going on. Where's the rest of the data? Now let's jump to the end of the story. 3 months later. We soon found out that, calling Pennsylvania, that indeed there was a requirement by the state put on drillers to test occasionally their own waste and to indicate on this document that had to be handed over to the state what was in the waste. Now, to restate, these are the drillers doing their own self-reporting. So there's no inclination there to, overstate the bad stuff in the waste. But we found out after 3-4 weeks that there was a document. It was mandated by the state. It existed. It was required yearly. It was industry produced, and it was on file somewhere. Huge breakthrough, excitement. What's it called? I don't know. So we spent a week and a half calling everyone in Pennsylvania, trying to find what's the name of this document. I don't know, I've heard it exists, but I don't know. Finally found it's called 26R. It's the 26R. Another huge breakthrough. Yay, we now know it's called the 26R. So we think, okay, all we gotta do is open records requested, and we're home free. We can see what the levels are. And if they're low, we're gonna report that. If they're high, we're gonna report that. But we'll finally have data on radioactivity. We contact the state office, and they say, yeah, 26Rs aren't here. They're not at headquarters, they're in the regional offices. So a week later, we find out that, okay, so we send out requests to all the state offices, the regional offices, and they are these tiny little offices, because I went to them, usually one staffer, dusty, filing cabinet in the back, and they say they don't have the capacity to handle an open records request. You have to come in. Now we're going on another week, and this is all back to the value of documents. The editors are saying, look, we can put in the paper something, right? But the other editors are saying, no, let's wait until we actually land the documents. So we call they say, you have to come in person to the state office to get the 26 hours. Great. So I go to some, we hire some stringers to go to others, we all show up in the same week, and we're all told, oh, by the way, you have 45 minutes, that's your slot, you gotta get on the calendar, you only have 45 minutes, there's the filing cabinet, and there's the rickety old Xerox machine, you can't bring your own thing, and good luck with it. And so you're dealing with a filing cabinet this thick of material, and 45 minutes to do it, and your next option is 2 weeks from then. And you're dealing with all the state offices. Anyway, long-winded story to say, that's why no one knew how much radioactivity was in the waste. Because there was no, I don't personally believe, there was some evil figure or company figure or anything like that set out to make it so difficult. It just was difficult, and no one was pushing to make it less difficult. And therefore, an average reporter in a small venue simply didn't have the clearance from his editors to spend 5 weeks chasing this document. We didn't even know what it would say, called the 26R. So, I digress, but what we found were a bunch of things. One, the levels are pretty significant. Sometimes 3,000 times the of radium of the allowable drinking water level in the waste. The waste is being sent through sewage treatment plants, which are not equipped to handle it, released into rivers. No tracking going on of what happens, what levels are in the rivers. The rivers were, and this was a huge coup, Homeland Security does not allow the public to know where the drinking intake pipes are, for obvious reasons. If someone wants to do harm, they knew where the intake was, you could poison the whole city fast. We got lucky, we got leaked the map, obviously we weren't going to publish it, but we were able to put on a map with the intake pipes where the sewage plant was and where the intake pipes were. And suddenly we're like, wow, some of these are less than a mile upstream from the intake pipe. And among the things we found as we went step by step was that some of the waste was being disposed of by land spreading and road spreading. And so this gets, I'm finally getting close to your question. Some of the waste, when it was distilled down into salts, because it's really high in salts, was being used to melt ice, and some of the wastewater was being used to suppress dust. And some of the sewage slime, was being used to fertilize land. And the testing, land spreading, and the testing of what was in each of those, the salts and the slime, was minimal to non-existent. To the extent that it existed, it wasn't testing for radioactivity, it was testing for other things. So we never found the final dots, we never connected, and therefore there are dangerous levels in drinking water. We did not find it, we said as much. We didn't have the data to be able to answer that. Nor did we find crops or cattle that were showing up with harm or radioactivity. We didn't find that. But we did find a real lack of oversight to ensure that it wasn't happening at the final stages of how the waste was being handled.
You mentioned, first of all, thank you for all your work and your elucidation of a difficult issue. You said that you had originally become interested in doing the series, as it turned out, because you were concerned about this constant binary analysis of jobs versus the economy, and you wanted to get the discussion away from that and bring a lot more things. Now you're talking about the incredible importance of data and getting the data and how much trouble you had to go to, and you know what you're doing to get the data. And so I was wondering if you could please address if it would ever be possible to do a similar database analysis that would get us away from what seems to be the line now that is used by so many people, that we need natural gas as a bridge fuel while we are ramping up renewables. Now, there are many people in this room who believe that it's a bridge to nowhere, but putting that to the side, that seems to be the sort of binary debate. You have that on one side, and you have the Stanford studies that show that we can be almost 100% reliable on renewables in X amount of years, 30 years, 20 years, whatever it is. And so those seem to be what things are boiling down to now, and I'm wondering if that increases your interest in perhaps trying to get away from that.
So I'll try. I am not reporting on this further because I'm focused on other targets now. One thing I would say though is I actually believe that the bridge fuel trope is very much on the decline compared to where it was back when we started and before. So T. Boone Pickens was really pushing hard and had a lot of traction in Washington from Democrats and Republicans on this bill that would have been a shot in the arm to natural gas consumption. In essence, it would have mandated and incentivized city buses to switch from gasoline to natural gas. It didn't go anywhere, as you know. But back when it had legs, the bridge fuel, mantra was really common. But I guess I feel like I've read in the last 2 years a bunch of stories that undermine that, and simply do so by looking at the competitive disadvantage that renewables often have, and vis-a-vis gas when it's at $2 per BTU or $3. And actually, in the end, the way that natural gas, especially at this current low price, is killing the renewable industry. And how I've read stories, for example, showing how that works, what that looks like. It looks like a state, is considering a 10-year contract, or is considering a multi-billion-dollar plan to build a new power plant, and they're deciding which way to go. And when they look at the options and they look at the budget in the state and they look at the belt tightening that needs to occur, and they're looking at cutting Head Start, really difficult real-world decisions, they think, well, I like renewables, but I also see that this natural gas stuff is really cheap, and so they are going more often with natural gas and not renewables. And that's why I think it is a bridge to nowhere. And I feel like, and you may disagree, most people see that now. I have not read an op-ed in months that uses that line. And
Just last week in the Times.
Okay.
Just last week, Elizabeth,
Well, who believes that paper?
Short questions.
Yes.
Short questions. Please.
Right. Why don't I go with you in the front row?
Just a follow-up to that question, I was wondering how subsidies might have played a role in the cheap costs of natural gas.
So, and Professor Barth's in the room, so I should be very careful. I'm going to shoot from the hip on this. I actually don't know. I haven't studied that. But my impression is that currently the price of gas is so low that it's not actually needing subsidies on the front end. The place where subsidies are desperately needed are on the consumption side. We can produce all this gas, and this is why there's a trend towards export, because there's just not the market to consume it here. And subsidizing the export, subsidizing the pipeline system to move it around, subsidizing the consumption in the form of city buses and these sorts of things, those are real, those are in legislation. But on the front end, on the production end, my impression is that, you know, all energy gets big subsidies, but it's not super noteworthy on the front end. Let's see where I haven't gone. With a hat.
It's very convenient. So I work for the gas industry, and I'm kidding. I wanted to say that, you know, before your stories came out, we were, I think, very much in the dark ages of this. We were, you know, I think there were stories that were being written, but this was such a kind of a crack in the veneer, and I think I can speak for a good many folks in this room that we were breathed a giant sigh of relief, and we're incredibly grateful for not just the stories, but the quality of the reporting and the things that you were bringing to light that hadn't been considered. So thank you for that. And it's indeed unfortunate that you're no longer writing on this issue. And I'm just curious, I know that there was a lot of pressure that was put on the paper by the gas industry. And I understand that, I think that they really went after you guys. To what extent did that influence the closing of this series and the kind of lack of reporting that's good? Because, you know, as you pointed out, there's many more stories to be told here, and there's many more stories I think that we, the people in this room, would like to see come to light. And since the series has ended, it's a little disconcerting to some of us. To what extent did that pressure stop the paper from continuing with the series or having another person take it on or whatever it is?
So the answer to the question is really not as dramatic as could be. And again, full disclosure, maybe I've drunk the Kool-Aid and I'm not willing to see things because I'm inside the institution. All that said, here's my impression of what happened. The series ran longer than the series normally runs. The series got amazing backing from the highest level in the newsroom. The series was exhausting for the hands-on contributors, my editor, his editor, myself, and the legions of other researchers and graphics folks. It was very taxing to deal with the public editor and the channeling of the pushback through that institution. And that's exactly what that institution is supposed to do. I'm a huge fan of the institution of the public editor. I disagree wholeheartedly with that public editor, and he with me. But it's exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, I think the answer to why we may not be covering the topic as much as the series was is simply that it's more mundane. It's the reality of a small set of environmental reporters who have to cover an environmental beat. And so that covers everything under the sun. I mean, environment as a beat is a huge topic, and this is only one element of it. And so we're talking about 3 or 4 reporters who are having to choose stories to make sure that they're touching on lots of different areas. And that's point 1. Point 2, and this is me speculating, I've never talked with them before, but I think the downside with putting so much of a spotlight on a topic like this series did is that it sometimes makes, I'm guessing, that it makes the beat reporters a little bit, and their editors, more reluctant to cover that because they feel like, well, we just ran a huge series on it. We spilled a lot of ink and a lot of political capital on it. So shouldn't we now try to cover some other stories for which other constituencies are clamoring for us to cover more? And so there ends up being almost a quiet after the storm that's painful for those who were really into that specific topic. And I think that's, to a significant degree, a factor. Why don't I go with you in the purple?
The health impact study, and if you could just comment a little bit on any specifics that you came across in your reporting and studying, and did you ever come across any refusal to respond to documents? For example, we do know in Pennsylvania there was at least 1 death from that fertilizer. In fact, there's an environmental group dedicated to this young man who died from that fertilizer, from the fracking wastewater. But, and we know here in New York State that this is such a critical question for us as to whether Shaw will release before he receives the in-depth impact study from Geisinger or not. So could you just kind of make any kind of talking about the health impact study as it relates to all of this, including its connection to the climate issue? Thank you.
I'm going to disappoint you, and I'm going to do so efficiently. I was very much avoiding New York. I work for the National Desk based in DC, and what we want to do is a national sort of story. And so, both then and especially now, I have not followed the complicated drama that is New York State. So I have very little to offer that you don't already know about the health impact study and sort of what's happening with that. I would say one thing. The interesting thing that we found with regard to the EPA national study, I think probably also applies to the New York study. And that is the story we did on the current and very consequential and woefully undercovered EPA national study was a look at, and again, much thanks to sources, some in the room, open records fights, we got documents that allowed us to look at the plans for that national study at different, almost snapshots at different moments in time. And when you put them all in sort of a straight line and look at them together, you see an amazing narrowing in the focus. And that makes sense because you have limited hours, limited staff, and you have to sort of choose your targets. But when you compare them with the clamor that was coming from certain frontline EPA scientists about really important issues that should stay in the national study and should be on the table and should be a focus of the study, and the tension that was occurring in the agency over what would and wouldn't be included, you see not just pragmatism, 24 hours in a day, but also politics and its role on science. And I think that, and one interesting thing on that story is, you see also how those who write the rules win the game. So the study set out to focus on, the national study set out to focus on fracking's impact on water and the safe drinking water. And when we started asking, well, why is it just looking at water? What about air? What about waste? What about life cycle? If the feds are going to do a study, why not look at the full issue? Because we're only getting one bite at this apple. 2004 study was a debacle, so let's do it right now. Let's actually look at the full issues. So who decided that it's just going to be looking at the impacts on water? Well, when you swim upstream to figure that out, you found language from a federal lawmaker, Maurice Hinchey, that said water, but when you talk with the staffer, as I did, who actually wrote that sentence, they were livid because that was meant to be the starting point, not the finishing point. It was meant to be the first question, not the last one. And yet, those who wanted to keep, including within the EPA, but outside the EPA, keep the focus narrow, kind of solidified that as the question, the only question, the first and last question. And automatically, all sorts of things fell off the table. I'm imagining that story can be replicated in other realms, be it on the state level, and sort of asking, wait, who decided that we're only going to look at these questions? Let's figure that out, and let's make sure that that makes sense, bearing in mind that it can't go on forever. There have to be some limits on what we look at. Anyway, it's a philosophical question, an answer to a specific question.
Thank you.
So we're going to take two more.
All right. I'll go with you with the glasses.
Thank you. You mentioned the leaked map of the intake, water intake that you use. I was wondering in general how much the reporting depended on leaked documents as opposed to the open records.
I don't have a 60% specific number. Some stories were 90% leaked, 10% other stories were the reverse. So for example, the financial story about the whispers, the skepticism from Wall Street types especially about the finances and actual profitability of these wells, 95% leaked. The story about radioactivity, 95% open records, 5% leaked. Some of the most important stuff, though, was that 5% leaked, including the study from the EPA official who, the simple question is expression, dilution is the solution to pollution, right? And those with a clue say, no, dilution is not the solution to pollution. It's a very risky way to try to water down bad stuff. This EPA official said, look, we need to see whether these rivers, when they receive this waste through the sewage treatment plants, is actually sufficiently diluting it so as to make it safe. And this official, who was skilled to do this sort of thing, actually did a full-fledged presentation and modeling of that very question. Actual levels of radioactivity that they had found, 3 different sizes of rivers, small river, medium, large, actual rivers in Pennsylvania, and given a presentation in a room much like this to EPA officials. And this was a question that my editor asked me, and I got wind of the existence of this report that had actually gamed out. So does dilution work? When we heard of that, I went full-fledged to figure out who that was, and then we couldn't get our hands on it through open records. So I drove to this person's house a couple states away and just showed up at their door and harassed them essentially, and pleaded with them, and came back the next day and said, look, I'm not leaving even though I had a plane ticket for that afternoon, until you did this report, you care about this, clearly you want it out as much as I do. There are ways to do this. Ultimately, this person gave us the report. It's in the document reader. Hugely important. Very few people have read it, but folks inside the EPA read it closely, especially the division of EPA that had been asking whether that had ever been done, and had been told by a different division, no such document exists. When they saw it on the Times website, were told they were livid, that it actually did exist, and by golly, why did they read about it in the Times? Anyway, so it's a mix.
And I live in New Jersey though, and I work outside of my job on immigration detention, which New Jersey is sort of ground zero for that. And we used to have a fantastic reporter, Nina Bernstein, who did the Death in Detention series, so I'm sort of mourning the loss of that series, but I see that you're writing on solitary confinement and other aspects of immigration. So is that what's next for you? Are you sticking with that for a while, or?
Yeah, and I share your admiration for Nina Bernstein. So my focus for safety in Urbina right now For how long, I'm not sure. We had a story in the paper 2 weeks ago.
That was very nice.
That spent the last year working on. So I don't have any other bullets in the chamber, and we're trying to figure out sort of what next to do. But I'd like to do at least one, maybe two more stories on OSHA, and then possibly pivot. The solitary confinement story was one that I got a tip that, and it was just a no-brainer story worth doing.